Shall we?
Shall we? We will get this show on the road. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kurt Gutjahr, the Managing Director for the Center of the American West. And welcome to the fourth in our series, Historians Imagine, celebrating the creativity in the craft, featuring Phil Deloria. This monthly webinar features conversations with path-breaking historians about inventiveness and vision in their work. We are recording this webinar, so you will be able to access it on our website in about a week's time. We're also Facebook streaming it live, so I believe you'll be able to access it there as well. We have one more upcoming event in this series. It's on June 9th, and it features Natalia Molina from USC. You can go to our website to register for that, www.centerwest.org. I'd like to thank the center staff and all the work that they put into putting this series on. It's been wildly successful, as evidenced by the number of people who keep streaming into the Zoom room. And I'd also like to give a special shout out to Kate Carpenter, who, after a WHA session featuring Matt and Patty in conversation about the role of creativity in the craft, suggested that we do exactly what we're doing right now. So she is our inspiration. Thank you, Kate, and good luck today. And we have one other series event that's coming up on the center's calendar that is not part of this series. It's part of our Bipartisanship and Friendship Happen series, where we bring politicians from either side of the aisle to come together to talk about the nature of bipartisanship and their friendship. And so on next Friday, May 21st, we had Scott McGinnis, a Republican from Colorado, in conversation with David Skaggs, a Democrat from Colorado. A couple pieces of housekeeping. If you will note in the Q&A, there is been a link posted. We put a little question in there. Where is the post Q&A session for this event? What we've been doing is going into a secondary Zoom room where everybody appears on the screen and we can engage in actual conversation. That doesn't mean you can't use the Q&A box here. If you have things that come up during the course of the seminar or the conversation that you'd like to note, please feel free to put it there. And so just make sure to keep that link if you want to attend that second session. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Patty Limerick, the faculty director of the Center of the American West.
Howdy. Thank you so much, participants, for coming and joining us here. Attendees, or who's a participant, who's an attendee? I got my categories confused, but participants on screen, thank you. And thank you, attendees, who we've enjoyed greeting. And really a special thanks to Matt Jacobson's parents, who lived in Boulder, Colorado. His father still with us here. And Matt grew up here, and that's how we got to know each other. I certainly knew his work. And then this conversation started occurring where he was telling me about the project he is doing on creativity in the profession, how we scrupulously teach all kinds of things about weighing evidence and asking research questions, but the word creativity is really not in the vocabulary in many cases of training our successors. So he is doing this project. He told me about it. We got to thinking about it. We did the project Really Happy Day at the Western History Association virtual conference, doing that session, and then just having Kate say to us what we, I think, must have had in our minds someplace there. Let's keep this going. Let's keep this moving. So we had some very excellent occasions of talking about who we would invite, and the results. I will just say we were very gifted at making that list. We were really high performers as talent scouts on that. So this is really Matt's project. I was coattails and a slipstream, and really grateful for that. And if there is a better collaborator on the planet, I can't imagine that. So here is Matt Jacobson, who will get us going in our conversation.
Well, thank you, Patty. I would have said exactly the same about you, actually. So we'll have to have the coattails argument later. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all here. And thank you, Phil, for joining us. We're really excited about this conversation. So as a start, it's become our kind of traditional first question, but it always turns out to be quite telling in one way or another, and you never know where people are going to go with it. But the question is, when did you first start to think that being a historian was a thing for you, that this kind of work could be a vehicle for your own passions? And for some people, this starts in fourth grade. For other people, it starts in college. For some people, it doesn't start until they're beginning a second career. But how would you, where do you think about when you got the bug, and how did that happen?
That's a good question. Okay, so the easy answer is it was in Patty Limerick's US West class. And that's kind of partly true, I think, or maybe even mostly true, Patty. So I was a music person growing up. I was like a trombone playing nerd. in high school, I was a kind of medium good trombone player. I was a music major at University of Colorado as an undergrad. I was a middle school band teacher, so I wasn't really thinking about history. Although I have to say, at some points, I had historical inclinations. I did take kind of a perverse pleasure in the music history classes that I think some of my colleagues didn't take. I was interested in thinking about connections across, music and music periodizations and composers and things like that with the Western Civ classes that I was taking. So it was sort of in my mind, I think. But I came back to Colorado. I did a master's degree in broadcast journalism. Not like you'd call that historical either. That was part of my, I think, sort of re-engagement with Native American history. And a move away from music and more into the things that I'm doing now. But that was very, very slow and gradual. And one of the things I did, as part of this was I was making a documentary film for my professional project about, Sioux Indian land claims on the Black Hills. I had to take a cognate class, and that class was Patty Limerick's class. And Patty, I think it was like a year or two after Legacy of Conquest had come out. So, you were basically teaching the frame of the book, and you were in. You had a real historiographical sort of sensibility. You were always, of course, talking about Frederick Jackson Turner, but you were talking about a lot of other people who wrote history. And, I would say maybe it is in that class that I started to sort of think about history as being, a thing. I was in the journalism school. They were just starting a PhD program, and they were encouraging me to sort of keep going from my master's degree and be one of the first PhD students. But I was realizing that kind of work that was going to happen there, as cool as it is, right, social science-y and research, and polling and those kinds of methodologies, that was really kind of not for me. And then, Patty, you and I went out to lunch, and you said, well, you should, maybe think about American studies at Yale, which is exactly what I ended up thinking about doing. But I should say, I also applied at that point to a Fulbright to go to Australia, and I applied to University of Indiana or Indiana University to go and do ethnographic film. So it's not like I had determined any real clear pathway. And so American studies was kind of the perfect way in. Mm-hmm. So another way to think about it is I really didn't start being a historian until I came back to the University of Colorado as a faculty member in 1994. And found myself teaching the methods class.
So, well, you skipped a step here. So at some point you do show up.
Interrupt just for 1 second, because I have a confession I have never made to Phil. And I was so close when I was writing recommendation letters for you. I was printing them out in the old-fashioned way, and I printed out the one to Indiana, and thank the Lord I looked at it before I put it in the envelope, because I had not done all the changes to Indiana. I was telling the people in Indiana that you would be a great success in New Haven. And I oh, what have I done?
Which turned out to be true.
So I found that just before sealing the envelope. And so I have never told you that I almost really just made a mess of everything by scrambling those recommendation letters. And now that's out of my system. And now please go back to what you were doing, Matt.
But it was a prescient observation on your part that he would do well in New Haven, was just the station stop I wanted to pause over for a second, Phil. So when you go to American Studies at Yale, what did you think you were going to end up doing, and how did you get from walking through the door of HGS for the first time to writing the dissertation that became Playing Indian?
I didn't necessarily see myself as having a kind of historian's sort of bent in the American studies kind of framework. So I was completely surprised when I got into Yale. Thank you, Patty, for the letter. By the way, I was completely surprised, and I was completely intimidated. People who remember me there in the first semester will remember that I did not speak in the first semester's worth of classes. And, and in the second semester, I basically set up as many independent studies as I could, so I could speak in small groups. I felt completely intimidated and completely out of place. And the one thing I kind of grabbed onto was like, oh, I've done some reading in communication studies theory. And so maybe this is something that I kind of have as a little thing, but I took a class in, communications studies, and I was not very good in it, frankly, so that was super, super slow. And I have to, thank my folks in my cohort, my friend Carla Rotella, who's basically taught me, kind of everything, Nikhil Singh, who coached me on Marxism, Susie Smith, who helped me sort of think about music in more sophisticated ways. So, my colleagues and my friends brought me along. And then and I have to say, playing Indian, people have heard this before, right? But like, just sort of literally appeared in my mind in about a 60-second span of time. I've never had another experience like that. And I'll just tell you the brief version. I was Bill Cronin's teaching assistant. I was sitting in his environmental history class. He put up a picture of Ernest Thompson Seton and the Woodcraft Indians. Gunther Peck, sitting next to me, turned and said, "Have you ever heard of this group called the Improved Order of Red Men?" I had, because skiers in Colorado will know that when you pass through Empire and you get the chocolate shake on your way back from skiing at Winter Park, there was an Improved Order of Red Men lodge, right there. And I had checked this out at some point. And of course, I was coming from Boulder, which was full of New Age hippies. And then I thought about the Boston Tea Party. It was like, ka-doom, 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 ka-doom. All of this stuff sort of, kind of happened. Alan Trachtenberg had been bugging me to write about Lewis Henry Morgan. It was like the whole universe came together in this super concentrated moment. That image, all of these kinds of things just like exploded in my head. And, kind of like 9/10 of the framework of the dissertation, and not all the arguments and not all the ideas, but like the basic framework just kind of rolled itself out. In that super quick kind of moment, which is why, and I should say, it was like maybe a semester after that I took David Roderick's film course, where we basically did this extensive reading of Walter Benjamin. And what I realized was that Benjamin was describing sort of what had happened to me as I conceptualized this, this project. And, so I've always carried Benjamin around as this sort of like person who has framed, those sort of experiences for me.
Can you talk about that in a little more detail, that kind of dynamic relationship between the big idea that is playing Indian and the kind of component parts that are kind of these anecdotal, always intriguing, quite varied instances of the principle? Because that turns out to be basically the structure of your second book as well, Indians in Unexpected Places. So can you talk a little bit about how that process works for you?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, right? Because, right now, certainly as I see it, one of the big historiographical trends is we write these big structural histories, like we have an idea, and that's sort of how both those books, they do kind of work that way. There's a real tension then, right, between like saying like, this is a thing that happens in the United States across, hundreds of years of history. It's like, that's not a very historical kind of argument, so to make it a historical argument, I think what you have to do is to dig into those sort of intermediate and the intimate, kinds of cases, and show how two things are happening at the same time. And it's the classic historian's toolkit, right? Continuity and change. It's like, hello, all the stuff that we, kind of talk about as the basic, building blocks. But the fact is, and I've always found this to be true, like when you go back to fundamentals, you find that there's a reason why they're fundamentals. And so for me, sort of tracking those changes across time and the specific cases was the way to make the kind of structural argument about continuity, and sameness and similarity, over time. And the same thing kind of applies to the second book. The books are kind of bookends in a sense, right? That Playing Indian is a very American studies book. It's all about America and American identity and all of those kinds of things. I wrote it kind of with the thought in mind that it would replace Robert Burkhofer's book, The White Man's Indian.
I was actually going to ask you about that.
Yeah,
and how would you describe your relationship to that book?
I've always thought that was a really, really good book, and it was super influential for me and really, really telling. But it also had started to feel kind of out of date, and particularly it's where sort of more theoretical stuff and more performance studies stuff seemed to come into play, where the kind of structural history argument seemed really interesting and really, really useful. I'll tell you, Matt, one of the greatest compliments of my life was, Patrick Wolf coming and saying, I was thinking a lot about your book because I was thinking about settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. And I was like, oh my, God, that's, such a deep, deep kind of compliment. And so he saw settler colonialism in sort of a, kind of a dialogic relationship, with that book in ways that I had never seen it, until it became visible. So it became visible later. But, that book is full of white people and it doesn't have a lot of Indians in it.
Right.
Whereas then the second book, I wanted to think like, okay, well, wait a minute. Like now let me reverse the lens or the figure ground here. And let's focus on Native people and how they live within all those white expectations, right, that I had talked about,
I am interrupting just to say that I think we have a general audience. We have many people for whom this would be unnecessary, but we have a general audience that probably needs to know what these two books are. So, beg your pardon. for interrupting, but if you could just do, I probably should have done that as an introduction now that I think about it, but if you could just take a minute and a half and tell people what books we're talking about here, and don't tell me what books we're talking about, or probably 75% of the audience, but if you could just take just a couple of minutes on that, I think that would be valuable. So sorry to interrupt.
I will do that, Patty, if you promise to hold them up as props, as you were doing a second ago.
That's what I was trying to say. Yes.
Because the first book's called Playing Indian, Yale University Press, 1998. It makes the argument that there's this pervasive thing that happens in American culture and society and politics, from the very beginning up to the very present moment, which is that white people like to dress up like Indians and perform and play at being Indians, and that this is an appropriation of identity. It's a materialization of ideological stuff that's floating around. Yeah, exactly like that. And that because it is a pattern, right? It's a really, really important thing. It's a book that kind of swings for the fences. I think of it in this way, in terms of like, this is an argument about American identity and how it's essentially wrapped up with Native peoples and the imaginary, kind of worlds that white Americans build around Native peoples. A bunch of stuff that got left out of that book, Mardi Gras, Europe, all kinds of other things. Second book is called Indians in Unexpected Places, University Press of Kansas, 1994. And it basically makes the argument that this book actually starts with this essay about sports, but it makes the argument that in the early 20th century, Native people jumped into and participated in and were formative to modernity around a whole bunch of different things, that they were violent after people thought they were pacified, that they traveled the world and the country acting, and that performance industries were really super important to them, that there's a whole kind of musical tradition that really matters, that they adopted technology and used it oftentimes for white people in the same kind of neighborhoods that they lived in. So there's an essay about sports, which really talks, and it springs off of my experience with my grandfather. And so the point of the book, Indians in Unexpected Places, is that there are ideological expectations that Americans form about Native people, but Native people live in the unexpected place, right? And so often, and that's the structure, really. Yeah, exactly like that, Patty. Thanks.
Yeah. Or was that the hairdryer picture?
Yeah. Yes.
I love
I
that.
apologize for interrupting, but now thank you very much. That was
No, not at all. Well, so Phil, you talked about these two books as bookends, and I read them very much that way. I now see them as foundational to the book that we're going to go on to talk about in a few minutes. But was the second book in gestation while you were working on the first book? How did that go in terms of your own process?
Yeah, not at all. I finished the first book, and I had been working on this essay about my grandfather in sports, which appeared in South Atlantic Quarterly. And I thought, okay, my second project is going to be all about Native people doing sports. And then I started thinking a little bit about the research. I started thinking like a historian, actually, Matt, which was to say, like, what do the data sets here look like? Well, one is sort of from the sports side, which is all statistical, and isn't super, helpful in a lot of ways. And the other would be the tribal side, which would be to say, like, well, would you sort of go to every kind of tribal community and sort of pull out their famous athletes? Because they're there in every community, right? They're all there. That felt like, as I thought about it, not a very good second book project, but like a retirement book project. So I was kind of casting about a little bit for, what I might do. And I did some conference papers. I did a conference paper on music. I did a conference paper on cars. I see that George Miles is there. I worked for George Miles at the Beinecke Library at Yale for a couple of summers. And George and I had a whole series of really, really important kinds of exchanges about language, about winter counts, about automobility, Indian automobility, cars, driving, highways, those kinds of things. So I'd done this paper about cars. I started collecting instances of Indian people doing weird stuff. So there was like a pole sitter in the 1920s. There was a Pawnee roller skating champion, right? It was those kinds of things. But they were really at the level of kind of trivia. They were small stories. And actually, I thought about teaching a class about like Indians doing weird stuff, and I sat down with Nancy Jackson, who was my editor became my editor at Kansas Press. And she said, I think this is a book. I think you could do this. This is a very persuasive editorial strategy. She's like, these are a set of essays. You could knock these off really quick. You could do a second book with Kansas really, kind of fast. It might not be as big a book as your first book, but it would be a fun book for you. And, so I thought, yeah, I could do this. And so those pieces then kind of came together. There was no sort of overarching sort of theme, really. Let me say this, it emerged really slowly, unlike the first book, right, where it just kind of appeared and I knew exactly what I was doing. In the second book, I kind of didn't know what I was doing. I was sort of feeling my way in essayistic kinds of ways. And what I really wanted was to find that all these Native people doing interesting stuff were hanging out together and like we're having dinner parties and there's just, I didn't find the evidence for that, historically, which was super interesting to me. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make a community argument about this group of people. And I ended up making a cohort argument, right? They're all people of a certain moment doing really, really similar things. And what's really interesting about them then is they're not actually, connected to one another in intimate ways. They're not exchanging strategies. They're coming up with similar strategies in different areas and fields, of their own accord. And that seemed to me actually a more powerful and telling, kind of argument. And so this is a book where, one of those books where in the conclusion, I was trying to figure out, I'm still trying to figure out what it's about. And this is where the question about modernity, and how Native people are constitutive of modernity really sort of came to the fore.
Right, which is why I see that as so foundational to the more recent work, which we're just about to get to. But first, I'm surprised to hear that the first two books were written in such different ways because they read so similarly. They're both great, but they read as though they came out of the same process, which you just narrated for us is not at all the case. So I'm curious what lessons you draw about your own creativity, let's just call it that, in looking at these two very different experiences of writing these books.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the first experience is, for me was almost mystical, magical, metaphysical. The second experience was really kind of painstaking. But even as I say that, I would say that each of those essays had a kind of magical or sort of mystical kind of moment. So I just finished writing a little a kind of Q&A with Thomas Andrews about, his writer's workshop, kind of stuff. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this, right? That, for me, there's the sense that my unconscious is this incredibly useful and productive kind of piece of me that I don't fully understand. But that I figured out these sort of ways to pose questions to my unconscious and then let my unconscious go and do some work, some thinking work. And then it gives me these little gifts, and I combine those gifts with, whatever kind of just flat out analytical cognitive skills I'm able to, to muster. And, so one could imagine thinking that like this unconscious thing is just a sort of psychological theory. It's all contained within the person. But I do feel like I've always felt like there's a metaphysical kind of dimension to it. It's not just me and my brain and the chemicals firing and stuff like that. It is about the universe sort of being part of, what it is I do and what we do. And so I would say like playing Indian kind of explodes that way over the whole structure, and Indians in Unexpected Places was kind of a series of smaller explosions, in different kinds of ways. So maybe they are akin in that sense.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'm not much of a mystic actually, but you've just described something that is similar to my own process, that when I'm working at my best, I feel like I'm tracing out lines of prose that already exist in some ideal state. And it's like it's being in the zone. Well, thank you. And I'm going to pass the mic to Patty to keep us moving briskly along, because there's still so much to talk about.
It is, but what an astounding moment. I thought that was astounding. And writing the lines that already existed, man, good heavens. Now I'm going to interview you. No, I was kidding. But I'm actually very happy with that transition, because I do want to talk in my mode of holding up books here about becoming Mary Sully. And I thought we would start with how, I'm going to say improbable to start with, but how improbable it was that you and this body of work that you write about, that you came together. And I did have in the notes to go, that seems like it's kind of providential. That seems like it's more than just, well, that was a happy accident. And so, boy, have you opened the door for me to say, okay, tell us the story of how you and the works that you spoke about here, wrote about here, and we'll get in a moment to give the audience some sense of what what we're speaking of here, but how did these works of art come into your possession? And was that a purely secular progression and story?
Yeah, I mean, Patty, it may seem improbable or it may seem inevitable, right? I mean,
Right.
those things are, I think, both they're two sides of the same coin, right? So this is the artwork that was produced by my great aunt Susan Deloria, who did art under the name Mary Sully. She did that to make a kind of gesture, genealogical gesture, to her grandfather Thomas Sully, or great grandfather, I should say, Thomas Sully, who was an American portrait painter. And she was active in the 30s, and she did these things called personality prints, which were about the personalities of people. They're triptychs, and as Patty said, we're going to look at them, a little bit later. So, she died in the early 60s. That material passed to my other great aunt, Ella Deloria, ethnographer and linguist, really quite an important person. She died and passed to my grandfather in the mid 70s. My grandfather was not totally sure what to do with it. My dad was a little hostile to this art, actually. So my grandfather sent it to my mom and said, well, you're a librarian, go catalog it or something, do what librarians do, get it out of my hands and, deal with it, because no one had really taken it seriously as art, right? I mean, there's a line in the book where I say, well, she might've been read as kind of the crazy neighborhood doodler, but this is so clearly not what she was. In any case, the box came to us. My mom and I sort of opened it up in the, kind of mid 70s. We couldn't really make sense of it. Some of the figures here are well known, Roosevelt or Bing Crosby, but lots and lots of them are quite obscure. And unless you know who they are, the more you know about this art, the more sense it makes. And so we had a hard time making sense of it, really. And then, we kind of put the box away, and we thought that it was lost. After my dad passed, my mom pulled the box out, and actually it had been all transferred to a suitcase. And at that point, you could sit down with your laptop and pull out an image and Google the person's name and realize, like, oh my gosh, now I see what the art means or what these images mean. And so you could get just a little sense of it. And I have to say, like, over the course of the project, the more you look at the art, the deeper it gets. So I was doing at that point a very superficial, kind of thing. I had to do a little paper at MAI at one point, and I sort of pulled out this art and did a 20-minute riff, and my friends who are art historians came and said, you should do more with that. You should do more with that. And I had this sort of, obviously I knew nothing about the art world, I now realize, and I thought, oh, this will be fun. I'll go to my curator friends and I'll say, why don't you curate a show of this stuff? It's really cool. And they said, yeah, we don't really listen when people say, I've got my crazy aunt, box of my crazy aunt stuff from the basement, and like, we're going to turn my museum over to you for that. Like, we're not going to do that. And so why don't you prove it to us? And so that's kind of what the book is meant to do.
Right. And really providential. I mean, it seems, I'm just going to linger for just a second or two more on that, but the notion of trusting the unconscious, that doesn't come up in most graduate courses. And True. Something is lost with that, because the way that you put it was spectacular. If you pose questions to your unconscious, and then it goes about its business and you go about yours, and then it gives you these units back. Should that be included in graduate training? That now we're all going to have a moment, we're going to get in contact with our unconscious, and trust me, this may not seem completely natural. Is that too wild an idea to think that could happen?
Well, I tell my grad students that in one way or another, on a fairly regular basis. I don't know that I build it into a, curriculum or anything like that. But I have to say, when I was at grad school, Howard Lamar encouraged me to do psychohistory. He said, go and read Peter Gay and see what you think. And, and so I read Freud and things like that. My dad was at that moment reading through the entire collected works of Carl Jung. So in some ways, I may be a person who's sort of primed to frame stuff and understand stuff in that, in that particular way. But yeah, I think it's quite a useful way of thinking about things.
And I guess I didn't really see this coming in the conversation. And I just think the young scholars' consciousness is overburdened, and it is stressful, and it weighs them down, and it produces anxiety and gums up the works, and and creates log jams. And so that's why I'm getting a little bit crazed here. And I'm going to now get uncrazed on
Okay,
that.
let me just throw in a more secular version of that, because I've never spoken to my students about the unconscious, perhaps because my father is a psychoanalyst and I have all these Oedipal issues about that. But I do say to them that their best ideas are going to come to them while they're washing the dishes or doing some other thing that is not concentrating.
Yeah, well, great. Well, good. This is really great. And I guess maybe I always thought I was the deviant and having to rely on these deliveries from another world or system. So this is really great. Thank you. Now let's go to the part where we show, Kurt is going to bring up our 4 slides so that people will get a sense of what we're talking about, and you'll discuss the book, and then you'll show us Mary Sully's work, and people will see something they never imagined they were going to see. If they haven't already read the book, I'm sure a good share of them will. So here we go. You're on.
Okay. Well,
you're very close. There you are.
There we are. Yeah, so this is just, this is the book. This is the cover is one of the designs, that she did. And we can actually, and this is her. And Kurt, we can actually just go quickly to the next slide, which sort of, kind of nets it out a little bit. There's 134 of these. She called them personality prints. She started making them in the late 1920s. I have a pretty good sense of a pretty decent date, like 1928, 29 or so. A little less clear when she stopped making them in the 1940s. But you can see that this one is an example. Harry Emerson Fosdick is the personality. He was a kind of modernist, radio, preacher. In his case, and here you can see, knowing that, then you can see, oh, that's like the horn of a radio speaking, and those colored kind of jumble of things at the bottom of that top image are either people listening or perhaps sound that's coming out, right? And she's very, very interesting and very good in that respect of sort of giving you doubled meanings. And then if you were able to look closely, you can see that the second panel basically takes some of the iconography and the themes and the colors and the patterns and turns them into a really beautiful design pattern. She had aspirations for these design patterns to be, industrial designs, to be turned into wallpapers and linoleum and cloth and things like that. And then you can see the bottom panel basically takes the things that you found in the first panel, the second panel, and converts them into a design. Oftentimes that design is very evocative of, a range actually of native kind of visual expressions, but not always. Sometimes it looks like Art Deco, sometimes it looks like other forms of modernist stuff, sometimes it's pictorial. So the bottom panels are super interesting. And then the argument of the book basically is that out of all the ways you can read it, you should probably read it from top to bottom, and you should read it as a development that starts in the modern and moves into Indian futurity, and that there's a politics to that I think is, is quite important. So as you can tell, it's colored pencil. She became quite adept with working with colored pencil, over the years. You can see her early style. There's a lot of empty space. Her later style, she's using colored pencil, devising textures and all kinds of things. So she's quite a creative artist. I think she's pretty much of a genius myself. And with that, maybe we go to the next panel and we can look at one. So I puzzled over this one for a very long time. I've rearranged them on the screen. So the one on the top left is the top, the one on the top right is the middle, and so on. So it looks like a kind of a humanoid trilobite, in the center of the page here in the top panel. You can see those sort of 2 pink eyes, those 2 yellow kind of bands seem like arms sticking out, and there's a kind of humanoid sort of waist and figure, but it doesn't really seem like that's what it is. It just seems odd, and it's quite clear that there's notes associated with it. And a quick glance at the Wikipedia page tells you that Lawrence Tibbett was an opera singer who then converted into being more of a popular singer. He kind of oscillated back and forth between the two. So I couldn't quite figure it out. And it was only doing more research into Lawrence Tibbett. And here I want to give a shout out to Jordan Weinberg, who was the undergraduate research assistant at University of Michigan, who did this fabulous work uncovering a lot of the details of these folks. So it turns out that not only was he an opera singer and a singer, but he owned a little cabin in a place called Temescal Canyon outside of Los Angeles. And next to that cabin was an amphitheater stage, and he would go stand on the stage of the amphitheater and he would sing, and the notes would resound out of the canyon. And knowing that fact, you suddenly realize that what you've been seeing is a trilobite sort of centrally coming at you. is actually negative space. It's the interior space of a canyon, and that those bands that you see on the rights and left, black and purple and red and blue, and those kinds of things, that's sedimentary rock of a canyon, and that the notes are literally at the bottom of a canyon emanating out, and suddenly you look and you see that these are hills, and the blue beyond it is the Pacific Ocean, and voila, it makes sense to you. What's super interesting though is if you go to the second panel and you look at those little Easter egg figures. I mean, first of all, it's just visually beautiful. I hope you'll all agree with me. It's just visually stunning and beautiful material. But if you look at each of those little Easter eggs, what you see is that she's taken the image and flipped it upside down, that the bottom of the Easter egg is the blue of the ocean, and the top of the Easter egg is the bands of the sedimentary rock. And so it's like looking through a camera obscura, right? Or multiple camera obscuras, 15 of them or so. At the same time, the little Easter egg, which is the camera obscura, is also converted into a note and put with clusters of kinds of notes. And so it's quite ingenious, what she has done in terms of thinking about this. And then when you go to look at the bottom panel, you'll see that, rotational symmetry, which is something she really, really used a lot of. It's almost like the kaleidoscopic, kind of nature of these notes. So I hope you all agree with me. It's quite a lovely and beautiful and intelligent piece of work. And Patty, are we showing one more?
We do have this one. Should we hold this and come back to it? Okay, we'll hold. Thank you, Kurt, and we'll come back to this. And this is the oddest thing. This Jenny Price made me cry too. So this is really turning into a curious theme with Historians Imagine. That was the relationship between her and you, and that just seems to have done me in here. So okay, so
as Jenny and I have often said, we wrote the same dissertation at the same time in the same place. Hers was just about birds, and mine was about people dressed up like Indians, right?
Well, that's what I'm reaping over. That just makes me weep. So that's just interesting that I'm having this problem. So I want to talk about categories. Well, actually, first I want to take just a moment more on the time period and on the celebrities. That does get you quite a few passages where you get to be not exactly a regular old historian, but you get to be a little bit of a regular old historian, and you just get to write about some historical figures and Sullys and so on. And you also have these celebrities who are representing a time, the late 1920s into the mid 1940s. So how do those celebrities really work so hard for you in giving you the connection to the time period of modernism and its variations, and so that you get this full aesthetic immersion in the images, but you also get to say, well, now we're understanding this time period better, which is, you will never be a regular old historian. I don't know why I use that phrase. That's a ridiculous phrase. But anyway, could you speak about the celebrities as really your workers and making that connection to the time?
Yeah, what a great image, Patty. Thank you. They are workers. They're doing work. They were doing work for her, I think, is the, and of course, then as I'm translating her, trying to understand her, you're right, they're doing work for me, as well. I mean, I think the thing that's really important here is to sort of think like, I've tried to differentiate her from the really beautiful and amazing and emergent Native American arts, of the 1930s, which is really, really important kind of work. But I think it's super important that she is traveling in the company of her sister, right, who is learning ethnography from Franz Boas, and who is taking this, kind of insider view of Lakota and Dakota culture. At the same time, her sister is like taking this anthropological ethnographic view of American culture writ large, right? So the two sisters are doing this very interesting interwoven parallel kind of project. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that they spend a lot of time talking to each other, about this. They're like a double star, right, in an intellectual, kind of way. So if you think, well, what she is really an ethnographer. She's a vernacular ethnographer learning from another vernacular ethnographer who's learning from Franz Boas. First of all, like, you don't find that every day. But second of all, then you have to narrow down and think, like, what is she trying to say about each of these people? What work are these celebrities doing for her? And that's where it becomes very interesting to see her choices, So there's a number of folks who, Today, we would talk about sort of queering the pitch, a little bit. She does Patsy Kelly. She does Lunt and Fontaine. And she explicitly represents, for example, Lunt and Fontaine as being in a lavender marriage. So she's thinking about these kinds of issues. She picks people out who are on the margins, but also people who are at the centers, who have power. And so one has to kind of grapple with, like, why did she choose these people? What does the universe of those people look like? Who did she leave out? Curiously, there's only one artist in the entire, array, and that artist is a completely anonymous, sort of just amateur from, New York City, and it's kind of a mystery to me what she's doing there. So I have not been a good historian in sort of tracking that, that particular thing down. But I think, in sort of like figuring out the histories and the personalities of the celebrities, linking that to the images, to me, that's where a lot of the analytical kind of magic, happens. It's where the pieces come to life.
Right, great. I was going to ask, I've had two different ways I could ask this, that you certainly give categories that other people have just accepted and subsided into. You give categories a really rough time. My heart, I'm not going to weep over them, but my heart almost goes out to categories when I look at your stuff over the years, because other people, other scholars, and this may be really the nexus of the creativity thing in lots of ways. Other people are just, well, there's the category. Now I got that as I'm a specialist, and here's a category, and others have validated this. And you see a category and you're general. You really don't just swing hard at it, because that wouldn't be subtle and would be, but boy, I wouldn't want to be a category around you. You just really go at them. And in ways I don't even know that they know what's happened to them. So could you talk about, and I think, by what I mean by categories, obviously there's American art, a canon of American art, and there's Native American art. There's one kind of ethnographer and another kind of ethnographer. There's modernism and there's Indian tradition. And so they're all out there, and they're very well positioned, and they get reinforced all the time. And we're not going to weep for the categories because they just get a lot of power and attention, but you just can't let them sit for a moment. They just have a really rough time. So could you talk about your relationship to categories, if that term is making sense? And if you ever build up to, have you ever seen a category you like?
This is so interesting, Patty, because like if you had asked me like, hey, how do you work with categories? I would say, oh, I'm a really categorical thinker. Like I just love to think in categories. But maybe it's that I have to destroy other categories, or question other categories in order to make my own categories work. Well, that's right. Let me say it like this. I think it's super useful to build categories, right? So I am a quintessential American studies person, right? And I want to start with the text. But I'm not an English department person, in which like the text allows me to jump up and make a big theoretical claim. It's like I'm historical enough to understand that like I take my text and I got to surround it by 3 or 4 other texts, and I got to surround those texts with another 15 texts that show up in the footnotes. And when you do that, like you're asking yourself, what are the categorical reasons why these texts belong together, right? And I've used the word genre to talk about this. But in a way, what we're talking about is actually the formation of a particular kind of category, and then asking, what does that category say? And then asking, how was that category formed? Am I just making it up, right? Or did it have an integrity of its own? And then asking, and what wants to jump out of the bucket, right? Like what doesn't belong in the category? Right. So Patty, I actually probably learned some part of this from you, frankly. So when I was at Michigan, I spent, 16 years teaching in the Tetons. And one of the very first things I did was put up a map of the American West and say like, okay, does North Dakota and South Dakota belong in the American West? Does California and Oregon belong in the American West? What's the logic through which they would belong in that particular kind of category? I actually have a whole video where I'm standing there with a bucket that says West, and I turn it around and sort of shift it around and pull states out and pull them, put them in. No, Oklahoma is Southern Crossroads. It's a different category, right? So I find that actually sort of constructing and interrogating categories, for me, it's super, super useful. And I think if that's kind of your way of thinking, it makes sense then for you to say, well, what are the static categories which we've been functioning before, and what questions ought we ask about those things?
Well, I'm so enriched by that, because I thought it was get the darn categories out of here. But in fact, it's not that. It's put them in relationship to each other in ways that they haven't been before. And Matt, I'll get you there in 1 second, but I will just quote, I have several quotations that would support my interpretation here, which is, if I might use this as a text, our inability, this is a wonderful passage where you referred to Mary Sully as an impossible subject. And then the following sentence, our inability to situate her suggests that we take a deeper look, a deeper look at our operative categories. And so that's a deeper look, which I understand now is not what I was getting at with you just take them out, you just take them down, because you actually give them a very vigorous round of exercise. And if they hold together, they are in different company with other categories. So I'm sorry, Matt, I'm just.
No, not at all. I think I just have a different way of asking a similar question, because Phil, when I was reading this book, I had two completely contradictory reactions. One was, oh my God, everything Phil has ever done in his life was leading to this work. I can see it all there. And the other was, holy shit, man, where did he find or take the permission to do this? Because it's in some ways, it's such a radical departure from what you've done before. And you had to kind of make yourself over, at least in disciplinary terms, to do some of this work. So I don't know how you feel about those two versions of what you've done, but I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, dang, man, I think that totally captures it. I mean, I feel like this is like the project of my career. I think it's the best thing I've ever done. It's likely to be the best thing I will ever do. And that is nothing on me. I think it's the material, because the art is so amazing, so world historical, amazing, right? That I'll never work with material like this again. I mean, and I'm just going to work with this material for the rest of my career, right? I mean, if not the rest of my life. So in that sense, it's like, yeah, there was a whole kind of thing, kind of pressing, in this direction. And I would say, like, this goes back to, my dad's metaphysics of the family, right? Which is like, when he sent me off to grad school, after grad school, he's like, okay, there's a family thing here. You got to figure out what you're going to do within the family thing. And, we all do something different. And my dad always had this very reassuring thing. He's like, yeah, all the men in the Deloria family kind of knocked around, didn't know what they were doing until they were about 30. That's you, but you'll figure it out, right? And so it was oddly reassuring, but also oddly, I don't know, alienating in a sort of weird sort of way. So in that sense, yes, I mean, it feels like everything has been building to this. But you're exactly right. I mean, I felt like I really am diving into, art historical kinds of stuff that I haven't really paid that much attention to. So it was a lot of, kind of work. And you're also exactly right that it falls between the disciplinary cracks, right? I mean, historians sort of look at this and they're like, well, he's trying to be an art historian, and I don't know how successful he is, but he's not being a historian and whatever. And art historians, I should say, have been, the ones I know have been really, really good and really, really supportive. But like the world of art history, yeah, maybe not, maybe
right.
not.
Well, the world of art history has,
right.
that's a whole other conversation. The only thing I'll add is, on the one hand, you're too young for this to be your life's work, but my life's work I wrote 20 years ago. So
It's getting very painful now. Legacy of
Oh, I'm older than you think I am, Matt.
All right. So,
we are almost strict contemporaries. We were born near the same place at around the same time.
Okay, so let's moving on from writing one really fine book and not doing so much else. Let's not do that anymore, because that's getting a bit too close to home here. So let's go to just helping, just orienting the audience to that phrase that is so crucial, that Mary Sully was native to modernism. Mm-hmm. So could you annotate that? And do you want the Indian history thing to speak on that, or do you want to just speak without the image?
Well, we could pull the image up, and I could talk about native to modernism. So native to modernism was going to be the title.
Was that right? Uh-huh.
And I mean, I've been super lucky, right, with the first two books, like playing Indian, like, I think objectively, it's just a great title, and people have glommed onto it and sort of used it. And Indians in Unexpected Places has been, kind of the same way. I always thought of it as, kind of version of a Beatles song, Indians do in unexpected places, doing unexpected things. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, that's kind of where it was in my head. and maybe that speaks to me that music is always floating around, you know, in all of this creativity, you know, kind of talk. But for this book, I didn't really have, like, I didn't have a title that was quite that good, right? So Native to Modernism, you know, is sort of there, but it's not quite that good. But it does very intentionally sort of make the double meaning here, which is to say, like, and this goes back, as Matt, you were pointing out, to Indians in Unexpected Places, which really ends with this argument that, like, I'm not interested in alternative modernities or uneven modernities, that, like, if modernity is a condition, right, that Native people are in the heart of it and they are constituent of it and they are sort of shaping it. And so being indigenous to modernity, right, is to say, like, yeah, no, Native people are in it just like the rest of us are. But there's a kind of claim within that, right, to something that is, you know, distinctly Native. And, you know, and so this image, you know, for those who know the book will recognize this, and who don't can sort of anticipate it, because I'm sure you're all going to run out and buy it. It makes a great holiday gift. This is kind of the keystone image. The book starts and ends with this, in part because the image is so complicated and so confusing and drifts away, I think, in some ways from so many of the other images. Like that middle panel, there's no way that that's going to be your wallpaper, right? And so I want to sort of think, like, you know, if industrial design was important to her, what does this middle panel, which is so clearly not industrial design, mean? And part of the way to think about that then is to say that, oh, this is actually aesthetic. I mean, this is an artistic claim, you know, that she's making here. She's putting a stake in the ground, you know, around this. So, I mean, I do a very, very long reading of this image, which we don't need to go into, but I think one of the ways to think about it is, this is part of her aesthetic cosmopolitanism. I see the top panel as being a gesture to Diego Rivera and the muralist traditions. I see those silhouetted figures as being gestures to, you know, Aaron Douglas for sure, you know, Jacob Lawrence maybe. The timing is a little, you know, hinky on that, but Aaron Douglas, you know, absolutely. The fact that this is a history kind of panel, and thinking about it in relation to Aaron Douglas. So I think it's part of her kind of cosmopolitanism. At the same time, this is a totally Native claim, right, on history. And it's a claim that points to a kind of futurity. And I think that's the thing that's really important, right? She uses these 4 bands, I'm pointing at it on my own computer, but at the top panel, to sort of show, you know, this was the good life. This is how it used to be. This is the bad stuff that was happening with this kind of graphite, you know, reservation, you know, kind of scene of despair. This is how challenging it is right now with these feet, like literally stomping down on these aspirational kind of silhouetted figures, you know, of modernist angst and anxiety. In the second panel, she takes all those forms, those bands, and converts them right into this swirling kind of pattern, and then flips the whole thing on its side in the bottom panel. So if you're moving from the outside to the in, you can see what has become an abstract representation of the feet, the modernist anxiety, the barbed wire, which is the hurts of history, and then only one band down the very center, overwriting that barbed wire, right, is all of the colors that come out of that sort of Indian scene, that idyllic scene. And those colors are the colors of parfleche painting, right? A kind of Plains Indian women's, you know, art, one of the many forms of Plains women's arts. And I think that's super, super important. So, you know, this is a reading in which I'm saying, like, look, you know, she is all about being native to modernity, but she's doing that within, you know, a Dakota kind of framework that's super important for us to recognize.
Great, thank you. So, Kurt, we can go back to the screen now. I have a little short on time here. I had a question about Mary Sully's wit and humor, which seems evident. And I love, maybe I'm not, obviously I'm even less of an art historian than anyone could be, I suppose, but I always thought that portrait was kind of the solemn, staid form of art, because they're aristocrats, celebrities, I guess, and they're holding their little papillon dogs. I mean, I thought portrait was really a solemn and staid thing. And it seems to me like she's really making fun of that by calling them portraits. She's really making fun of that. And she's making fun, it seems to me, of the art critics who will not necessarily ever see her stuff, but she's sort of anticipating how to make fun of them. And I wondered, well, first, if you were seeing that as well, but maybe the core of the creativity and the relational thing here is that she's kind of making fun of you from time to time. Or does it ever feel that way? Or just a question?
No, I think I think there's, like, I would not say that I understand this art, and I've spent a lot of time with it, right? You know, I can pull some of these out and spend time with them and see things that I hadn't seen before. and some of those things, I think, Patty, you're quite right, are all about sort of, there's a wit, there's an absolute wit that's sort of put here. Sometimes it's in visual forms, there's visual puns, things like that. Sometimes it's, I think, the selection of people, I mean, one of my very favorite ones, not because it's visually beautiful, but because it's so interesting, such an interesting choice, is Alice Fazende, the last living Confederate widow, who shows up in a tiny, tiny little bottom of the column thing in the Saturday Evening Post in the 1930s. Like, why choose that person? I mean, so yeah, so the thing is full of wit. I think it absolutely has a sense, and I tried to sort of frame this at the conclusion of the book, that it speaks to the future, and that, like, as we sit in the future, we cannot see the past in the ways that we have seen the past before, because of the things she was able to say in that particular moment, right, which were meant to speak beyond her, beyond her own time. And she's clearly drawing, this is the other thing that's interesting about her, she could be drawing from the art of the 30s, from social realism and regionalism and those kinds of things. She's so clearly drawing from the art of the teens and the 20s, right? So some part of it is this also, this kind of looking back. She's out of time. It's part of her being an impossible subject, right? She doesn't have any of the trappings of modernism. She doesn't have any of the trappings of native arts. She's out of her time, both in relation to the past and in relation to the future. That's why I think she's world historical, right? Because how often do people manage to figure that out? And what does it mean even to figure it out? I don't even know.
So we're really almost out of time, and we do want to hear, and Matt is going to be the one asking you about your time as a dean and what you see as the historical profession and its official actions and departments and so on. What you see as the promise for creativity in younger people, and what you see as maybe not that. And Matt, actually, I'm sorry, you're the one who had this question worked out. So ask the question.
Well, no, I think that that's basically it. That I mean, the whole premise, I think, of this series is that it's, at the end of the day, it's creativity that lights us up about each other's work. If you just point to your favorite books on your shelf, the reason it's your favorite is because of the creativity involved. And yet we kind of shun it in the classroom, or at least we hide it a little bit, or we palm it. And I think there's always this sense that the kind of risk-taking that we associate with creativity is actually a danger in institutional settings. And so I just wonder, from your vast experience in administration, kind of what your advice is to younger scholars.
Yeah, I don't know. My experience isn't that vast, but it was an important part of has been an important part of my career, I have to say. I mean, so the university basically, as far as I can tell, sort of is interested in creativity, right? Wants to be a creative place, has programs and structures and things for making creativity happen. But at the end of the day, it kind of falls back on, like, well, to be creative is to be interdisciplinary, right? I mean, which has gotten so worn out. The fact, but the truth of the matter is, like, to do true good interdisciplinary work is actually to situate yourself in a creative place, right, with people who are going to, like, get your head moving in other spaces. The impulse there is not wrong. It's just that the thing is kind of atrophied on the vine, I think, a little bit. So that's one piece of it. I mean, the other piece of it is, like, if you take the risk and you succeed, then the university is totally happy to take credit, for your creativity. And if you take the risk and you fail, the university is so happy to turn its back on you. And I think, like, that's the sort of fundamental problem. If a university wants to actually encourage risk-taking, that it has to accept that, like, it will sometimes lead to failures. And, if that failure means, like, you don't get tenure and they show you out the door, well, that hasn't accomplished anything, really, for anyone. And so what you end up with then is that, super common piece of advice, which I've also handed out too, which is, because it's good advice, which is, like, do something that's going to get you tenure and then do something else. And oftentimes we frame that in terms of politics, but I think it applies to creativity, as well. And it's not how it should be. I don't know. Patty, you and I could go into old stories about me as an assistant professor at University of Colorado, among some of our colleagues. I mean, but the fact is, I felt like Playing Indian was a really creative book. I was pretty confident in it. I wasn't really afraid of anybody sort of passing judgment on me. I probably should have been more afraid, but I kind of wasn't. I think some of our colleagues recognized that I wasn't afraid. I think that pissed them off.
Mhm.
So that's a bad cycle, you know, it's just a bad way to think about doing it. So I don't have an answer to this, you know, Matt or Patty, but it does feel to me like identifying that as a problem and sort of asking, you know, are there some other kinds of structural things that we can do within the university would be really, really helpful, you know, because it's part of the rut, you know, that we're stuck in.
So
Right.
your closing remark, do you have a closing remark, Bill? Is there something that you didn't get to that you thought, how miserable not to be able to speak briefly, very briefly on X or Y?
I feel like we've covered everything. I mean, I'll say one more thing. I'd say, you know, I spent a long time in this, you know, Wyoming class teaching with my best friend, Greg Crane, you know, my best teacher friend. And we taught Thoreau every year. And every year I came out of teaching the second chapter of Walden, like totally energized and juiced and inspired for like, you know, 6 weeks after. and why? Because I think it sort of encapsulates, you know, kind of this approach to things, right? You let your unconscious give you gifts, pose problems to yourself, pay attention, you know, to the world. I mean, I think this is the bottom line. Black Elk said this, like, pay attention, right? I mean, this is a super important thing. Like everything that happens in the stream of life that we just have to blow off and let become, you know, because we have to be robotic to be functionary, you know, or functional. That's the stuff that's the secret sauce, right? And the secret sauce is passing by us all the time. And if we just sort of stop and slow down and grab that little thing that's just weird, where ordinarily we would go, oh, that's weird, and then we would move on. If we slow down and grab that little thing and say that's weird, and then like pull on the string, like that's where interesting stuff comes from, I think.
Mm. Yeah.
This is the
great.
place where, instead of the American West, in ordinary physical life, we would all be doing the standing ovation. If we all stand up, it's just going to be ridiculous. So it's going to be, so we have to do this for now. But well, that was so spectacular. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thanks, Phil. And everyone, we replicate what in a brick and mortar world would be the open discussion. But to do that, we're going to move to a Zoom room where it's not just the three of us on screen, but everyone, all participants, and you'll have a chance to either post questions or to raise your hand and ask questions and have them answered in real time. So the link for this next Zoom room can be found in the Q&A right now. You can follow that link, and we look forward to seeing you just momentarily in a different setting.